Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our guests today. It's a pleasure to host you again. We are at our fourth session, and I just wanted to share some housekeeping notes for those who have attended other sessions. You probably know the drill by now, but we do have closed captioning options. So if you do require closed captioning, you'll see there's a button that says show captions, and the session will be completely captioned. Bonjour et bienvenue à notre session sur le patrimoine mondial et la résilience climatique. Donc, on a les interventions seront en anglais aujourd'hui, mais on a une option que la session soit sous-titrée en français et dans la langue de votre choix. Donc, pour accéder à cette option-là, sur le bas de votre écran, il y a un bouton qui est écrit Show Captions, donc montrer les sous-titres. Et si vous cliquez dessus et ensuite vous cliquez sur la flèche qui va vers le haut, vous pouvez avoir accès à la langue de votre choix. Donc, without further ado, I'd like to give the mic to my colleague, Mathieu Dorméals, to introduce our session today. Mathieu.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Stéphane. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone in this session. My name is Mathieu Dorméals. I'm a Vice President of ICOMOS Canada, and I've got the pleasure to host this session around World Heritage and climate resilience. And so we're going to have 3 presentations and then a few minutes to have an open discussions and question and answers. To introduce the session, just to recall that the 2021 IUCN World Heritage Outlook found that the greatest threat facing natural World Heritage sites globally is climate change. In the context of climate change, the management and preservation of World Heritage offers strategy to raise awareness of its impacts on natural and cultural diversity, to build resilience, to learn from local and traditional knowledge systems, and test innovative approaches to adaptation and mitigation measures. However, heritage professionals will also face difficult choices as heritage is lost, and difficult decisions will need to be made about what conserved. In the actual context of the COP in Egypt at the moment, and 30 days from the COP on biodiversity here in Montreal, it is a very good timing to talk about World Heritage and climate resilience. So I'm very, very happy to moderate that session. We're going to have 3 speakers. First, we'll hear Cathy Daly, then Cindy Gibson, and we'll close with Leanna Wigblodus. So I will introduce Cathy. Cathy is the climate change and heritage researcher, an ecological conservator, and lecturer at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. She's actually in Ireland, if I understood well, and also a researcher at Carnegie International. Cathy?
Great, thank you, Mathieu, and thank you very much to ICOMOS Canada for inviting me to speak to you. It's evening here for me, so hello. Anyway, whatever time zone you're in. So the next 50 years of World Heritage, but I'm focusing here today on World Heritage and climate resilience. And obviously that is, in my opinion anyway, going to be one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge that World Heritage faces. Next slide, please. So this is what we're dealing with. This, if you don't know that, this is show my stripes. You can look it up for your own region. This is the global temperature stripes. So we're already in a period of climate change brought about by human activities, as we all know, and it's likely to get worse. Next slide. So what are the implications for heritage, for World Heritage in particular, but for all heritage? The impacts they can be subdivided between the direct impacts of the changing climate. That can be either catastrophic sudden effects such as floods or landslides, fires. These are highly visible, so they tend to get a lot of attention, but they tend to be quite localized. Or there's also the less noticeable, but possibly over the long term, more widely problematic issue of cumulative or slow onset effects, which are caused by a change in, change in the climate, causing a change in deterioration of sites and monuments or natural heritage. There's also the indirect effects of climate change, and those are also quite visible, I think, particularly in Ireland, where I am at the moment. There's a lot of issues around retrofitting of historic buildings. So the indirect effects, yeah, there we go. There's the tortoise and the hare. You can hit the button one more time, Stefan. And we'll get a little person. There they are. Okay, so the indirect effects are about how humans will react to climate, either through mitigating greenhouse gases. And when I use mitigation in relation to climate change, and there is an issue here in terms of language and being able to talk across disciplines, mitigation in climate change terms is very much purely used in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that could be through, developing renewables in cultural landscapes, or retrofitting of historic buildings, all very important, but needs obviously to take account of heritage values. And then adaptation is changes in order to adapt to a changed climate. But that can also be changes in land use and sort of more intangible heritage aspects. Next slide, please. So I don't want to go too much into the impacts of climate change, because I think, to be honest, you're probably all seen some of them already and are familiar, and they will vary depending on where you are, but obviously just a few pictures to sort of highlight what we've already seen. So riverine flooding, this is a World Heritage Site in the UK. Next slide, please. Venice, obviously the poster child for coastal flooding. And some of these impacts are things that have always happened, but the scale and rate of the change is what's causing concern. Next slide, please. This is sea level rise and coastal erosion. Next slide, please. We're just going to zoom through these. So the other issue, of course, is that as the scale and rate of these impacts increase, the ability of these sites to recover, the costs involved in restoring the site to working order, the losses involved in closing, for example, Ellis Island. It wasn't just the humongous cost in terms of reconstructing after the hurricane, but also the loss of income because the site was closed. And in this COP in Egypt at the moment, there's a lot of discussion of loss and damage. And the fact is that a lot of the countries that are least developed, that made the least contribution, if you like, to greenhouse gases, which are now causing these problems, are also suffering the worst effects and cannot necessarily, they don't have the resources necessary. So that's what loss and damage is about, sharing that out. And I think that also needs to be considered in terms of the World Heritage System itself, but we'll talk about that maybe in the discussion. Next slide, please. This is one of the slow impacts, the sort of slow onset effects that I was talking about, changes in pests and in biological activity. Can maybe go unnoticed for a while, but can be quite destructive. Next slide, please. This is a picture from one of Ireland's World Heritage Sites, Skellig Michael. There's an increase in rockfall and slope instability there. Next slide, please. Landscape change, this is from Saguaro in Arizona. So a lot of the thing with climate change is a lot of the effects are kind of cumulative. So here there was a drought and record heat, which meant that the cacti, the young cacti, didn't survive, and then buffalo grass sort of moved into that space. But now that's a greater fire risk. So there is this kind of cumulative effect as well and many of the impacts of climate change are quite complex because of that, because they come on top of either existing stressors or they interact in different ways. Next slide, please. And of course, fire. Wildfires are a big problem in some parts of the world, increasingly in parts of the world that aren't used to it. And it's not just the tangible heritage that gets affected, but also the intangible. So ways of interacting with the environment. This is the Cherry Blossom Festival in Japan, where they're increasingly having to use artificial cherry blossoms because the cherries are not, it's not predictable when they're going to flower. But there's lots of examples of traditional practices that are, tied obviously to the environment that are having to change or possibly being lost. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture from Bahrain, from the World Heritage Committee meeting, I think it was 2018. And this is a site managers forum, the World Heritage Site Managers Forum that ICOM ran. And I was there with Andrew Potts. You can see him in the very back taking a picture. And Will McGarry, actually, if anybody knows him. And we did a session with site managers on climate change. And in this picture, I was at the top and I was asking them, have you experienced the impacts of climate change? So that was already in 2018, and you can see that the majority were saying, yeah, we're seeing it already. So this isn't news. Climate action then is kind of, that's the way that we need to address climate change, right? So it's climate action is a phrase that encompasses both adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation being measures taken in order to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, so increasing resilience, and also to benefit from any opportunities that there may be. And then mitigation, again, as I said, all about reducing greenhouse gases. And they have to go hand in hand, because if we don't mitigate, we'll have to do a lot more adaptation. And at some point, we won't be able to adapt our way out of this problem. So in actual fact, the best thing that we can do for World Heritage is to meet our Paris Agreement targets and to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. If we can do that, we'll save a lot more sites than by sort of, playing around with how we should develop flood defenses or something. And all of the states parties to the Paris Agreement, who would include the states parties also to the World Heritage Convention, have committed to climate action. So it would seem like we're all on board this train, but obviously, as we all know, it doesn't always work like that in reality. Next slide, please. So what about World Heritage policy and climate change then? In 2007, there was a policy document adopted by the committee, which was on a strategy to address the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties. And I don't think I'd be unfair to say that it didn't really make a lot of difference, probably, to the way things were done. It did, I'd say, for cultural heritage, it was probably a very important sort of watershed moment. I think our natural heritage, like I'm in the cultural heritage side of things, I think natural heritage colleagues were way ahead on climate change already. For cultural heritage, I think this probably was the start of people engaging with the idea of climate change as an issue that we needed to engage with. But not a lot really happened until 2016. So 10 years later, the committee asked the World Heritage Centre to review the policy and to make recommendations. And so that was a meeting on the island of Vilm. And that's actually one of the things that came out of that meeting was this creation of the climate change working group. Well, I mean, I think it was probably on the cards already, but it certainly got momentum from that meeting, the ICOMOS climate change working group. because we were formed specifically to then feed into this new policy that was being drafted. It took a while. It was done by a couple of consultants, and they did a lot of consultation, and ICOMOS again fed in quite a lot into that policy. And it was accepted by the committee in 2021, and it went to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly refused to adopt it. So it's currently back in what's called an open-ended working group of states parties. There was an expert group that looked at all the issues that were outstanding and made recommendations, and I represented ICOMOS on that. And now we're back into state party meetings. So, you know, the hope is that the policy will be adopted this year. But what I think what's interesting is that if you look at the title of this policy, it's policy on climate action. So it's, you know, in that period, we have moved away from just worrying about the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties to thinking also about mitigation and the responsibility of World Heritage in terms of climate action. So it's a much more holistic way of looking at things. Next slide, please. So most of what I do is around vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning. So that's what I'm going to talk to you now for the next few minutes about. Vulnerability is, you know, vulnerability depends on the exposure to the hazard, whatever hazard it is, on the sensitivity to that hazard, and on the capacity to adapt. So it's really around adaptive capacity that we can make the most effort in terms of reducing the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. And that's adaptation planning. And so I am on the Climate Action Working Group, and I've been leading on the development of a new toolkit. So the Climate Action Working Group committed ourselves to producing a series of toolkits to help ICOMOS members to kind of give them an entry point into various climate change topics. Just as, you know, sort of a simple starter for ICOMOS members, and, you know, plus a list of resources. So the first one that was done was on climate justice and equity, and the second one that's just been done is on climate adaptation. So we've sent the first 3 versions to ICOMOS, and it's going up on the website. We want to launch it on the 12th, which is Climate Adaptation Day at COP. But it may already be available on the website. I'm not sure, to be honest, if it's live yet. The great thing about working with ICOMOS volunteers is that we speak so many different languages. So it's going to be in English, French, Spanish, Bangla, Persian, and one other language that momentarily escapes me. But anyway, Portuguese. Yes, Portuguese. So that should, because that, you know, a lot of things are produced in English, I would say, and that does limit, I think, the availability of this information to people. So hopefully it should make it much more accessible. It's freely available, and as I said, there'll be a list of resources for people to take a more of a deep dive into the issue if they want to. So that might be of interest for you, and I hope it is, because I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about it. So next slide, please. So in the toolkit, we start off with, and it's, if you know the climate justice one, then you know this format. We start off with, you know, what is the problem? Very basic, a couple of paragraphs. What is ICOMOS doing? So we list the kind of relevant ICOMOS resolutions and things, documents. And then what can we do now? And so the what can we do now, we have 5 headings. So the first one is increasing knowledge, understanding, and capacity. And that's because really we need to, obviously, to understand the problem before we can address it. And one thing that we would suggest is that heritage practitioners need to understand climate change science, not in depth, but understand the language. For example, the use of the word mitigation, understand what the projections are for where they are and what that means in terms of impacts. And then reach out to other sectors and the public in communicating that and the fact that heritage is at risk, but also the fact that heritage has stuff to offer. And it's important to avoid maladaptation. So the best way to do that is to make sure that the solutions you're coming up with are very much rooted in place and are informed by knowledge of the place where you are and by the risks. Next slide, please. So building resilience, you know, it often just starts with maintenance. Really, you know, it doesn't have to be very high tech, it can be, but also heritage can build resilience within the communities in terms of sustainable development. In some communities, for example, traditional farming practices may no longer be possible. So things like heritage tourism may actually have something to offer those communities in terms of staying where they are. Next slide, please. Not everything will be able to be solved simply just by, as I said, doing some maintenance or, you know, making your building more weatherproof. And while we're all engaged in managing change, our concepts of what that means may need to change. And this is an issue that people often say to me around World Heritage. You know, how much can we change before we risk losing, you know, damaging the values for which we're listed, and what about authenticity and all these kinds of concepts, but OUV obviously being the big one. I don't have an answer to that really. It's something that has to be negotiated on a but we can discuss it, and it is something that came up in the discussions on the World Heritage Policy as well. But I think we as a sector need to become a little bit more flexible. Next slide, please. So as well as preparing for change, we have to prepare for loss, because we're not going to be able to save everything. And I mean, I guess there's always loss, right? Particularly archaeologists are quite comfortable with that in terms of, you know, preservation by record. But again, if you're dealing with World Heritage sites, it becomes a different kind of discussion. But preparing for loss is something that we have to do, and coming up with ways of celebrating heritage values that are, you know, that maybe are novel and maybe we wouldn't have considered before, and perhaps some good things could come out of it too in terms of building new kinds of relationships with these places by being creative. And next slide, please. And most importantly, possibly, is that we need to be part of the solution, because this climate change problem is, you know, the existential crisis of our age, and if World Heritage isn't, you know, they're contributing to the solution, then kind of what's the point? You know, if we're preserving this for future generations, then we have to do it in a way that's sustainable and actually is for future generations. So we really need to be models for best practice. We need to make sure that we cut our emissions, you know, and we need to offer the solutions that are there in terms of, you know, place-based, sustainable ways of living, traditional practices, etc. Also sense of place and community resilience that can come from heritage. Next slide, please. And just to point out that this is in the Paris Agreement, Article 7, which is all about adaptation, states that adaptation planning should be based on the best available science, but also traditional knowledge, knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. So, you know, the value of heritage is already there, really. We just need to work harder to make sure that it's useful and it gets out there. Next slide. So this is just a plug for the Climate Heritage Network. If you're not already involved, they're doing an awful lot at COP. So as you know, do follow their hashtag Climate Heritage. And they are all about empowering people to as it says, realize low carbon, just and climate resilient futures through culture, which includes heritage. And I think that's the last slide. Yes, thank you for listening. And there's my Twitter handle if we're still all going to be using Twitter in the future. I don't know, but that's it. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That's a very good starting point for the forthcoming discussion. And so we're gonna go on with the next presentation, which is from Cindy Gibbons. Cindy Gibbons is the visitor experience team leader in Red Bay, a National Historic Site in Newfoundland and Labrador, and works with the Parcs Canada. Cindy.
Hi. Good afternoon. Just quick correction. I used to be the visitor experience manager. I'm currently responsible for cultural resource management for Parcs Canada in Western Newfoundland and Labrador. But I hail from Red Bay. It's home, and I've worked with the exception of the last few years, the better part of 20 years at this site for Parcs Canada. And also was involved in, or heavily involved in, the nomination process for the Red Bay Basque Whaling Station World Heritage Site. And I thank you for the opportunity to present this, and I feel a bit humbled in this international context, speaking about this little tiny site on the coast of Labrador. And I'll try and introduce you to it as much as I can, and hopefully leave you with an understanding of some of the things that we're going through there related to changes in our climate. So I have the next slide, please. Oh, that didn't come out well. So on your left, you'll see a bit of a locator map, and that one's gone a little bit squished on me. But we are on the very south coast of Labrador, on the north shore of the Strait of Belle Isle, which runs between Newfoundland and Labrador. And the other map there does show the World Heritage Site, and it is our location. You'll see the outline in purple is the designated World Heritage Site, and there are some overlapping jurisdictions there. I think the next slide might explain that. Nope. I mean, no, excuse me. But we are, the Red Bay Basque Whaling Station is designated in short because it's the most complete and best preserved example of early commercial whaling in North America. And I guess that kind of moving away from localized whaling in certain areas into a large commercial enterprise that was economically very important. So this is the largest and best preserved example of that. Can I have the next slide, please? What we are protecting at Red Bay and what's part of the World Heritage Site are basically archaeological remains related to that whaling station. We have both terrestrial and underwater elements. There are 4 16th century Basque shipwrecks related to the whaling industry in the harbor. And on all sides of that harbor, there are about 12 to 15 of what we call shore stations or rendering areas where whale fat was actually rendered to produce purified whale oil. And I'll show you this photograph in a bit greater detail in a few minutes, because this is actually the site that I'm going to be focusing on today. Next slide. So yeah, this is a little bit of a better image of that, the World Heritage Site itself on a map. And I use this one because it shows a bunch of overlapping jurisdictions. Parcs Canada is responsible for areas on there, if you can see them outlined in green. For the most part, that would be Saddle Island, which is that huge island that protects the mouth of the harbor there. And on the mainland, you can see a bunch of different colors that overlap. And without getting into great detail, that's an area of shared jurisdiction, mostly between the provincial government of Newfoundland Labrador and the municipality of Red Bay. And Parcs Canada does own a few small plots of land in there where we have interpretive infrastructure to interpret this site. So it's a long-standing partnership between three levels of government, basically, to protect, preserve, and present the Red Bay Basque Whaling Station. And I have to give a shout out to the community of Red Bay. It's tiny. Right now, there's, I don't know the exact population, but somewhere between 100 and 125 people that still live there. And I think I can honestly say that if it weren't for the benefits of tourism and hopefully sustainable tourism, this community would not continue to exist as it is. There's also a great sense of pride and ownership amongst those 125 people for this whaling station, for this World Heritage Site, and they're very protective of it, and they always have been. So next slide, please. So I am going to focus this bit of a discussion today on Saddle Island. This is where most of the archaeological research, the terrestrial archaeological research, took place. And that was simply because there was nobody living there that would be displaced by the excavations. The most, I guess, heavily used and densely populated in terms of archaeological sites would be the mainland shore opposite. But for the most part, we left that undisturbed because it's still a very viable part of the community of Red Bay. So next slide, please. Oh, there. My little arrow went astray there. I'm not sure what happened in transferring it. But this is the site that that we'll focus on. And I just refer to this as Area C, which is nothing more than an archaeological designation. Area C is a shore station. There was a rendering oven, which is a stonework fireplace, basically a huge one, where whale fat was melted to make oil. And that's what you see in this photograph. And that nice straight wall there is the back wall of it. And you can see it's very close to the shoreline. What really makes this one stand out is that it's the most substantial example of a rendering oven that we excavated at Red Bay. So it's one that we're kind of, you know, attached to, and we'd really like to keep intact if we could. This is, I think this photograph was about 1983 or 1984 during the peak of the terrestrial archaeological research at Red Bay. And you can see how well preserved that is. And also it's, I can't remember the exact length of it. Is at least maybe 30, 40 feet in length there. So it's very substantial. And yeah, as I said, one of the important examples. We have about a dozen of these. We didn't excavate them all, and of the ones that we did excavate, this one seems to be in the best shape. So next slide, please. This is from 2009, which at that time we were in the midst of developing the nomination document for the World Heritage Site. And I'm pleased to say that my red arrow stayed in place on this one. It's pointing to that same structure that I just showed you. So this is, we've stabilized it. It's stabilized with sandbags on the interior of the fireboxes, and then covered with some silt and some sods that we've used there. And it's you know, grown over quite nicely. You'll see a few other images where we've cut the grass down so that you can really see the shape of this. but this is 2009, and I just want to draw your attention to that nice straight piece of grass there on the shoreline that I really took for granted, I guess. So this was the state that the site was in when we went through the World Heritage nomination process. Next slide, please. During that process, as you all probably know, we were asked to identify some factors that could potentially impact the site into the future. And at that time, climate change was being talked about. We were seeing reports of rising sea levels, more intense storms, increasing wave action in the oceans, and all those sorts of things. So we did put that in there. But honestly, at that time, we really didn't feel we were going to have to deal with it quite as quickly as we did. So next slide, please. This is that same site that I showed you with the nice red arrow. On a November day, I'm looking at the date, I think it's almost exactly 4 years ago. I was working at the office in Red Bay, and one of my colleagues came in and just made a comment that, boy, I've never seen the tides so high as they are this morning. And I went outside and took a look around, and he was right. And I heard more comments that week from community members, older community members in their 70s and 80s, who said they had never seen the tides come as high as they did that particular week. And as you can see there in that photograph, there's actually some waves breaking on the shoreline there. And the tides have gone right up into that nice protective layer of grass that we had growing there for the site. And when I was taking that photograph, this is really zoomed in, but I was standing on a dock on the opposite side of the harbor, and the water, the tide was so high that it was literally coming up through the top boards of the wharf. And I guess in my life I had never seen that, but my father, who's 86 now, has said the same things a number of times in the last few years, that these tides are extremely high. So they are having an impact. And the other thing about this is the increasing wave action. And you saw the maps of Red Bay there. It's known as a very sheltered harbor. It's one of the best sheltered harbors along the east coast of Canada. I had never seen waves break inside the harbor. I grew up right where I was taking that picture from, and I had never seen this before. And what's happening is the waves in the offshore are very, very intense, and they're driving into coastal areas. And so we're getting this wave action inside the harbor at Red Bay. And you can see from the photograph, it wasn't a windy day. It was quite calm, but that wave action was still driving in from the North Atlantic. So next slide, please. So this is a couple of years later. We were monitoring and watching. So you can see what's happening there. This is that my three colleagues there are basically standing right next to that archaeological feature. And you can see that on the shoreline, the waves and the wave action is starting to undercut the vegetation that's there. So it's kind of eating under the layer of vegetation into the things we put in place to stabilize and protect that site. So next slide, please. And this, I think, from roughly the same time, this is some drone photography that our archaeologists did. And you can see that piece of shoreline that was a nice straight one with grass growing right to the high water mark has now been eaten back, and looking at it from this angle, looking straight down on it, it's very obvious that we're losing that protective cover that we had in place there. So we asked a branch of the federal government that we work with, with Public Service and Procurement Canada. They have a group of heritage landscape folks who prepared a document and gave us a number of options of how we could lessen the impact here, how we could basically save that piece of shoreline. So they did present us with a number of options. Next slide, please. And the short-term option was fairly simple. It's a layer of sandbags, and our idea at that time, this was in November 2020, was that we would place the sandbags, and that would give us some time to look at other options that we could do on a more permanent basis. And you'll see it's the same lot of sandbags. It's just looking at it from a different angle. I always photograph this site looking east and looking west, so we can see what's going on there. Next slide, please. So this is June 2021. It's after the first winter of the sandbag installation. They held up pretty well. We did lose some. Some went into the harbor, and a number of them we could just replace, put back, and continue using them. In the meantime, we had been considering a more longer-term solution. We discounted a number of long-term, very intrusive solutions like breakwaters and solid barriers, but we're looking at one particular solution that was being used in other areas of Atlantic Canada. It's the coconut fiber logs. I can't remember exactly what they're called, but we were watching what was happening at a site in Cape Breton where they were being used, and so I was literally researching sources and figuring out where this stuff would come from when there was a storm in, I think it was January 2022, this past January, that pretty much took out the whole installation from that site in Cape Breton. So we were kind of back at the drawing board, thinking this is not standing up to the types of storms that we're getting in Atlantic Canada. Next slide, please. So this is what I found when I went to the site in June this year. And I think over the winter, before we could actually access the site, we had thought we'll have to rethink this idea of using the coconut fiber logs. And so we went back there, and again, the sea and the ocean and all the storm action had taken some of the bags away again. But what I did notice was that vegetation had actually started growing within the pile of sandbags. And the only word, when we talked about climate resilience, when we're doing this session, that's the only word I can think of for this, is that the vegetation there has taken hold, and it might actually be inadvertently creating some new protection for us. So those sandbags, we've left them in place again this year, and just observing what's going on with them and seeing how they're holding up. 3 years is a long time for this type of sandbag. It's just burlap. It's all degradable, but somehow nature has helped us out a little bit by planting that grass in the sandbags. I have no clue where this is going to lead us. It's an unknown, and we've been having very difficult discussions recently about whether we can afford to do something that's more in, more long-term here. Is if we spend all this money, is it really gonna stop the impacts of the high tides and the increasing wave action? We don't know the answer to that, and I was very encouraged to see this grass growing in my sandbags this spring, I have to say. Next slide, please. So that's where we are with my Area C rendering oven. It's still an open-ended question. We really don't know what the best solution is there. We're still talking and we're still discussing. In the meantime, we have other sites nearby. This is very close by, and there's a mound there, and the grass is cut down really nicely there. You can see it's an unexcavated rendering oven. It's one of the half a dozen that were left unexcavated by the archaeologists. The issue here, I don't think is coastal erosion. I think it's actually runoff from the heavy rains that we've been having, and it's taking away the cover there on near the water, and you can see the bedrock is visible from underneath that layer of moss and grass. So this is the other issue that we have to consider is, this is an unexcavated example. We don't know the extent of it. We don't have nice maps and drawings like we have of the Area C structure. So our short-term plan for this one is some ground penetrating radar to tell us the extent of the site and what it is exactly that we have to try and preserve there, because this is an unknown. We don't really know what's under the ground here. Next slide, please. And the other, I guess another issue we're dealing with is our infrastructure on Saddle Island. And this is, there's an interpretive trail that basically winds its way along the north shore of the island that faces the mainland part of the community, and it takes visitors through the archaeological sites and interprets at various places what's been happening there. The picture on your left from June 2021 is damage after that winter's storm. And in 2021, due to this and the pandemic, of course, we actually didn't open the island to visitors. We really didn't know what to do with this site. And for this year, we had our internal maintenance people. They actually created a bit of a temporary solution so that visitors could actually walk on that trail and then access the archaeological site. So you can see that there on your right. I'm under no illusions that this will withstand the storms that we're likely to have this coming winter. One of the other issues, or I guess the results of climate change, is the waters in our oceans are obviously warmer because we're not getting the freeze up that we normally would. By now, early November, we'd normally have, 25 years ago, we would have had ice in the harbor, and that would be the beginning of the winter freeze up. And that would last all through the winter, and in some cases, the harbor would be frozen until May. Right now, we're lucky if the harbor's frozen for 6 weeks out of the winter. And that's what's allowing, I think, all this wave action to have impacts on the shoreline, is that protective ice cover is gone from the harbor, and the storms that are out in the North Atlantic, especially the northeasterlies, are pounding waves right into the harbor and directly onto the shoreline. Next slide, please. So this is a bit, it's from a consultant's report on rerouting that trail right in that area that I just showed you. So we're actually moving it away from the shoreline and avoiding that area that keeps washing out and just rerouting it a little bit there. And I think the plan is also to make it a bit of a raised boardwalk so that if we do have wave action coming into that area, it'll just go under the boardwalk and not cause that damage to infrastructure that we've been seeing. So those are this is just an example of some of the solutions that we've been thinking about for this site to help us deal with these impacts of climate change. And getting back to the community itself, as I said, the residents there are very very attached to this site. And even though this may be a losing battle against the impacts of climate change, we feel that we really need to try and protect what we have there. The tourism industry is very important for this community, and our role as Parcs Canada, as the steward of this site, is to help protect it as much as we can. And again, that's it for me. Thank you for listening, and I hope I've left you with some sort of understanding of this small site and some of the challenges that we're facing.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a very clear example, and I think we probably could go back and ask maybe a few questions about the future, how you foreseen the future measures and the way to preserve actually the site. Thank you very much. And so we will continue with the last presentation, which is given by Leanna Wigblodus. Leanna is currently a PhD candidate in World Heritage at the University College in Dublin, although she's currently in Canada, in Ottawa, if I understood correctly. She has recently received the Daly Award from ICOMOS Canada for her work as an emerging professional. And she'll be presenting on the Connecting Practices project that she worked on. Leanna?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, as noted, my name is Leanna Wigblodus. I am a current PhD candidate, but the work today that I'm going to be presenting, I did with ICOMOS Secretariat in Paris, and it's the Connecting Practice project for the most part, but I did throw a little bit of my own research in as well, so hopefully you find this interesting. So yes, the Connecting Practice project, it's a joint initiative between ICOMOS and IUCN. For those of you who don't know, that's the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The first 3 phases were completed between 2013 and 2020. The goal was to basically explore and learn about new methods and approaches to site management, which is based on the interconnection of cultural and natural values at the sites. So a large part of this project was to also define the practical strategies that could be helpful for future work to create a fully connected and holistic approach and assist with sustainable use outcomes. Conservation recommendations were included in this, and a particular emphasis was really on reflecting on the insights and perspectives of local communities and custodians at the site. So the project actually used a bunch of World Heritage sites, and they were 3 phases. I've listed the 3 phases here. So basically in phase 1, the petroglyph complexes of the Mongolian Altai in Mongolia was used, as well as Sian Khan in Mexico, Konso cultural landscape in Ethiopia. And then phase 2 was the Hortbaj cultural landscape in Hungary, and the Melody Drakensberg Park in South Africa. Phase 3 used 4 sites, which was the landscape of the Pico Island vineyard culture in Portugal, well, in the Azores, the cultural sites of Alain in the United Arab Emirates, Saloum Delta in Senegal, and the cultural landscape of the Hongyi Hani rice terraces in China. Next slide. I think, there we go, thanks. So the outcomes and lessons learned, I'm just going to run through them really quickly. I have a few examples that I want to get to as well. But phase 1 really focused on the approach of fieldwork and the importance of actually being at the site to do the research that was required. So teams included 4 international members, 2 from ICOMOS, 2 from IUCN, as well as local representatives. So the approach was to really use a two-way learning process to encourage collaboration and cooperation in the short sort of time period that was available for the field visits. Teams were able to explore the use of traditional and conventional management practices and approaches based on multidimensional understanding of property values. This then eventually led to phase 2 of the project, where a further holistic approach was used to identify and understand the interconnection between cultural, natural, and social values, encouraging a holistic approach at all sites, and assessing local site governance and management. So again, throughout these phases, the importance of fieldwork, the creation of a common final report, and collaborative team visit, as well as an understanding of holistic values, so all values, not just cultural or natural values, and the development of practical strategies to manage biological and cultural diversity at the site level. And these were all sort of noted as essential management and elements and ways forward for conservation practices. Next slide, thanks. So phase 3 is what I really would like to focus on a little bit more, because the main focus here was to gain a better understanding of the cultural socio-ecological systems of the properties that were studied, to improve site management and to strengthen site resilience. So here I want to really bring out the resilience aspect, which was an important part of phase 3. So particularly in relation to assessing the dynamics of change and the use of traditional cultural management systems to approach resilience at site level. And again, phase 3 still continued to focus on fieldwork, on team collaboration, on recognition of all site values, not just cultural or natural, a holistic approach to management, and connecting partners in the field. So not just international colleagues from ICOMOS and IUCN, but in this phase, they also included the FAO and partners from the GIAHS program, which is globally important agricultural heritage systems, as well as the Stockholm Resilience Center, which I would encourage everyone to go take a look at because it's very interesting, the work that they're doing. A new element, as I mentioned, was resilience, looking at desirable and undesirable changes to properties, variables and thresholds, and the development of possible resilience indicators. In addition to the field reports, phase 3 also went a little bit further and included additional reports as part of their main report. So this included a questionnaire of site managers, which was important for sort of a two-way conversation. And then also this commentary on nature culture keywords, which I'm going to focus on a little bit further on, but that really emphasized 3 main topics for further consideration, which were resilience, biocultural approaches, and traditional knowledge systems. Excellent. So the main outcomes of this project overall, in general, were the strengthening of partnerships and the importance of including institutional, governmental, national, international, local, regional, sort of all levels and all people, creating inter and multidisciplinary teams. So not just having what could be considered as heritage professionals or experts in a certain area, but including many different experts from many different fields. In addition, the importance of fieldwork and on-site practice for a fully comprehensive approach was really highlighted as a strength of the Connecting Practice project, and developing a glossary of terms. So this idea was actually constructed based on the fact that often ICOMOS and IUCN being a cultural heritage organization and a natural heritage organization, will have the same words that they use in a lot of their work, but they won't necessarily have the same definition in both organizations. They won't have a common definition for these terms. So that was sort of the main idea behind the development of this commentary on nature culture keywords, which is also, as shown here, a separate document to the full report. And these are all available on the ICOMOS Open Archive on the ICOMOS International Secretariat website. Next slide, please. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of resilience, because for a lot of people, myself included a few years ago, resilience was very much a buzzword. It was sort of a term that you hear, you don't really understand. So I'm going to go a little bit into this. And this was also as a keyword for the culture, nature, or the commentary on culture, nature keywords. This was an important point that was supposed to be teased out a little bit more. So originally, resilience as a concept was used more in biology, in psychology, in physics, not as much in the social sciences as it is now, which is starting to gain a little bit more momentum. And it can generally be understood as sort of the capacity of a system to deal with change and to continue to develop after that change has happened. Resilience for us can sort of be seen in the way that humans and nature adapt to disturbances and change basically their ways of thinking and living to become something new. In addition to resilience, I'd also like to highlight adaptability and transformability, which are these two additional components of this main topic. So adaptability being the ability of the actors in a system to manage and respond to change, and transformability then being the capacity to create new elements of systems when changes are required. So basically, the ability of a system to recognize, learn from, and adapt to change as a general. One of the important elements, Thank you. One of the important elements to be aware of in resilience discussions is that there will often be a loss. There will be a loss of resilience at some level. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing, because part of resilience thinking also is deciding how much change can be tenable at a site and how required a change is. So it's sometimes desirable for a system to change. There's not really a cut and dry system for this. But as was mentioned, sort of, I think Cathy mentioned it in her presentation, it's very much a place-based system. It's a place-based evolution, and it has to be decided at that site. Again, where connecting practice and field work sort of reached a common ground, that's where we're looking at this kind of system of resilience. So resilience also starts from the belief that culture and nature are strongly connected. So once again, we're going back to connecting practice in this regard. Next slide, please. So although it's noted in both operational guidelines and the conventional biological diversity that heritage or that cultural and natural elements should be connected, they're often divided, or in the past they have been divided. So this idea of connecting practice, of bringing together culture and nature, also has a focus on resilience thinking. So for natural heritage, they sort of define it differently, as I was mentioning about the keywords section. For natural heritage, it's often focused on ecosystem resilience. So this is particularly due to natural disturbances, focus on agroecosystems, the idea of biodiversity and change. For cultural heritage, there's a different idea of resilience of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. This includes communities, it includes traditions, it includes land use practices, all sorts of different examples, I'm sure you all know. And then I'd like to highlight cultural landscapes, because as a whole, cultural landscapes are sort of thought of as the meeting point between cultural and natural values and elements for an area. And basically, landscapes can be seen as dynamic and constantly evolving in a lot of cases, and resilience of their social ecological systems is important, especially with this holistic value structure that I was speaking about before. So just to kind of finish this idea of resilience, one of my favorite quotes during research on this topic actually comes from Cornelius Holtorf in his paper in 2018. And it is that cultural resilience thus implies both continuity and change. Disturbances that can be absorbed are not an enemy to be avoided, but a partner in the dance of cultural sustainability. So this is sort of a key topic that I'm going to take into my examples now. Sorry, next slide. Thanks. So for cultural knowledge to building climate resilience, as in relation to the Connecting Practice project, the essential elements that were highlighted were an inclusion of cultural, natural, and social interconnections. And this includes understanding and recognizing values at all levels. As I said before, not just cultural, not just natural, but a combination of both. Traditional and indigenous knowledges and their use of biocultural practices. This also, though, has to be taken into account in relation to new adaptations and new technologies that are coming. So really a mixture of these traditional knowledges as well as an inclusion of new technologies is really starting to become a focus for research and a topic for consideration in heritage discourse, at least in my research. And then once again, this holistic approach towards practice. So working at different levels of not just local and not just government, but a combination of both, and then also the holistic values. So now I have a few examples, which hopefully will be interesting to everyone. These are based off the Connecting Practice project. And then I have a few more recent ones from my own work in my PhD that I've been working on. So next slide, thanks. Wonderful. Okay, so the first one that I'm going to present, and these are sort of sites that are dealing with climate change right now, sites that have shown to be resilient based on traditional knowledges and practices in the past, and which are now continuing to be fairly resilient. So I'm sort of going into our discussion questions, but hopefully you'll forgive me. So this line is an oasis area in the desert of the United Arab Emirates, and it's been occupied since Neolithic times. Traditional practices of this concern the creation of oases through water management and interaction between local flora and fauna, the traditional use of water management afflage system. And then these date palm oases have been created basically in the middle of the desert through the use of traditional knowledge of how and where water is running. So while current climate change threats also include desertification, temperature increases, and drought, traditional wells, irrigation systems, and water distribution techniques have made this area sustainable in a harsh desert area. These systems have also been in place for hundreds of years and have adapted to the location's constraint over time. Next slide. So these three were also included in Connecting Practice. The Hani rice terraces in China consist mainly of irrigation and terrace systems, which were built into the mountains of the region. You can kind of see them in the picture there. And again, there's hundreds of years of water management. This is the interaction between local flora and fauna, sacred and spiritual customs of the local people, and traditional rice production. And these have all managed to assist in the building of this area as well as the maintenance. Research has also shown that increases or decreases in precipitation and drought are the ones that are the climate change effects that are most harming the terraces currently. And although there is a sustainable management system here in the face of climate change, which was tested in 2009 and 2010 during large droughts in the area, it managed to be resilient and sustainable in the face of those droughts. Pico Island in Portugal, the middle picture here, is a volcanic island focused on viticulture. Sea levels are rising, increased storms and temperature changes, and the traditional knowledge and management of the grape crops, local land use customs, and seasonal changes have all been a part of this landscape structure for generations. This is particularly relevant in monitoring land use and water availability on an island landscape. The Saloum Delta, far right picture here, is in Senegal. It's made up of brackish channels, islands, mangrove forests, and numerous marine environments. And there's a history of traditional shellfish collection and fishing, which is particularly relevant as the site hosts many shellfish middens and mounds, which have shown over 2,000 years of cultural intervention and practices. The effects on this site from climate change are mainly rising sea levels and temperature changes, but local knowledge holders maintain an understanding of the previous adaptations that have happened at the site level and the knowledge of the importance of maintaining this type of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Next, please. So this is my own research for my PhD. The previous were all connecting practice sites that we had visited. But I have two more recent examples from this past 2 years. So the first one is the English Lake District, and the second one is the agricultural landscape of Southern Öland. So in the English Lake District, the upland farmers and hill farming has been a way of living in this landscape for hundreds of years, and there's generations of knowledge that have been passed on through parents to kids to, throughout the years, throughout these generations of traditional livestock herding is the most important part here. So shepherding and livestock management, as well as management of traditional agricultural practices, have helped to maintain the landscape and the high biodiversity values of this landscape. So climate change issues mainly relate to flooding and water availability, as well as increases in storms and temperatures, and increases in extreme weather events. Many of the suggested changes to land use and water management have been part of the farmer management systems for many generations already, and landowners and their knowledge of stocking densities and local biodiversity have really helped to shape this landscape and keep it as it is currently seen. In Öland, which is an island off the coast of Sweden, the traditional farming practices have included both agricultural and pastoral practices, and they've all been very adapted to a hostile landscape, in the sense that the Stora Alvaret, which is one of the largest alvar landscapes in the world, has it's characterized by very thin soil levels, so it doesn't host many plants, and if it does, they're very rare or endemic species of plants, and not necessarily grass for cattle. It causes difficulties for grazing and water management. However, generations of farmers, once again, have adapted to using the landscape based on traditional regulations and stocking densities. Climate change threats include sea level rises, increased precipitation and storms, droughts, changes to groundwater, and increased temperatures. And it was noted in some of one of the interviews that I did that before 2100, there's a possibility that the temperatures could rise between 3 to 6 degrees. Through adaptations to water irrigation practices, so irrigation pools is the main show here, and by limiting the number of animals in the landscapes, local farmers have been able to adapt and deal with past changes, as well as ensure sustainable land and water management today. So all of these examples that I've just shown you show how traditional practices have been dealing with and adapting to challenges for many years. We should be looking at these types of examples to see how traditional practices have addressed issues of climate change, water availability, and seasonal changes in the past, and how we can use these examples to work forward for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leanna. A very interesting presentation about the connecting practices project, but also the different examples and techniques and knowledge around adaptation. We're going to open the discussion. You have in Zoom, you have the Q&A window. So if you have any question for our three panelists, you can write it down in the question and answer. I just maybe to open the discussion. It was a question in Cathy presentations, and we see in Cindy's presentation that the evolution through time of the coastline and the effects of climate change, and again in your presentation, Leanna. So I guess it's a question a little bit for the three of you, but you presented various examples of techniques and knowledge that allows adaptation in harsh environments. But my question would be, what was the time behind that adaptation, and do we have the time to implement such solutions, or to adapt, or to let ecosystems adapt in face of the rapidity of the climate change? I don't know if any of the three of you would like to answer. I think there's it's a very sensitive question. The time behind climate change and the acceleration of the changes we are witnessing as something that at some point will be decisive also in the choices we have to make between what can be protected, what cannot be protected, and the adaptive solutions that we can hope to will work or not, given the time that we may be missing. And also in the elections that we have to do, in where to put our efforts and the resources to maybe gain something, or save some parts of heritage.
I'm not sure if what you mean by timing, and we've noticed these changes on the site over the last maybe 8 to 10 years, that the shoreline is starting to erode and we're losing it. The second we had those sandbags in place for 2 years before vegetation started to grow within them, which really did surprise us. We weren't expecting that. So I'm not sure if we have any answers to those questions. And sometimes I feel like we're flying by the seat of our pants up here, especially. We're in a really remote location. Any sort of major infrastructure development is very expensive. As would be any sort of major mitigation measures for these sites. We always, for building projects, we always add on 20 to 25% just because we're located on the coast of Labrador, and transportation costs are high, and they're getting higher. So our discussions more recently have been more around, are we going to continue to try and protect this shoreline, or are we going to let nature continue? Sometimes it feels like a losing battle, and we really feel like we have to try because of the community attachment to this site. I've seen, with threats in the past, some are related to natural process, some are related to human intervention. The community has been very adamant that protection of this site be first and foremost. That so we have to try and balance that going forward. And I don't think we have any kind of clear-cut answers to that question on time and how much, how fast this is going to accelerate, or what we can put in place while that's happening.
Yeah, thanks, Leanna. In the examples you present, there's some insight, I don't know, of places where solutions were adopted. I know that the FAO worked with some regions to implement new practices, or introduce new vegetables to adapt to the climate change. I don't know if you have any example where actually it was possible in the framework of that rapid change.
Sorry, it was possible in the framework of rapid change to adapt things?
Yeah, to implement that kind of solutions inspired by other sites that have adapted through time in harsh environments, as you presented.
I'm trying to think that through now, my work that I've been doing. I think that there's, well, just to sort of answer, I think from my perspective, your initial question as well, I think that we're constantly behind. And I think we know that we're constantly behind. The work that Connecting Practice was doing was really trying to focus on, okay, where are these connections? It's in the cultural and natural areas, but how do we really implement these management practices to encourage a better understanding of how cultural and natural values at sites can help in these sort of climate change mitigation or adaptation measures. As for sort of quick fixes, the Hangi Hengi rice terraces sort of comes to mind, mainly because they're a very biodiverse area. They have many different rice cultivation techniques that they've used, and they have the implementation, for example, of red rice, but they have different rices that they use at different times and in different areas, depending on water availability, what kind of season it is, what kind of climate they have at the time. So for example, if a drought happens, they're not going to use certain rices, they're going to use other rices. But this is, from my understanding, that's how the system works. It's a very adaptable system already. So it's not necessarily something that was put in now, it was something that was put in place generations ago. So I'm not sure that I have an example off the top of my head about sort of quick changes in recent years. I guess, well, one of the examples from my work in Öland, for example, they have realized that droughts, they grow a lot of strawberries. And the strawberries, they've realized, are not going to work in the future because they need a lot of water. So now they're adapting and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, even though strawberries are a big money maker in the World Heritage Site, particularly, what are we going to do to change this so that we don't actually use strawberries, which are a really big use of water, and instead we find a crop that is going to work well with the limited water resources that we have? Is that kind of answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The other question that struck me in particularly in your presentation, Cathy, was around inequity and the fact that you were saying that there's discussions at the moment in the COP around the poorest country being the less emitting less gas and being maybe the most affected by that. And I was wondering, from your point of view, what's the role World Heritage what role World Heritage could be playing in that management of inequity, and how to try to avoid or to diminish inequity in the sites, the risk management linked to climate change in those sites.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that there are already within the World Heritage systems, there are, there is the ability for state parties to build capacity, to share resources across the World Heritage system. There's the Sites in Danger list, which is intended as a mechanism to help sites that are struggling, to give them, to channel resources and expertise towards them. And there are within UNESCO more widely, there's the kind of ethical principles, which would also relate to this, and sustainable development goals. So there are a lot of mechanisms, I think, through which this can be done. The issue, though, is, and I think it's the same as the issue with preparing for loss, is that people are very slow to really engage with this. Like, there's still this idea that somehow climate change is something in the future, and that the reality of it still hasn't quite hit home. And so the thing with the climate action policy for World Heritage is being stalled because of political interests of the different states parties. And in that document, it talks about urgency for action. And I think this is really the key here, is people need to start taking this seriously. It is urgent. So whether you're preparing adaptation solutions or whether you're preparing for loss, you know, like Cindy was saying, the community are very attached to the site. Maybe we need to start preparing communities for the fact that some of these sites are not going to be able to be saved, and what do they want to do with them? You know, there's this sort of the time for politicians and decision makers to bury their heads in the sand is gone. But there is a lot of uncertainty as to how bad things will get, because, you know, also your question about coastal erosion. I mean, it doesn't happen in a nice linear fashion that every year we're going to lose 5 centimeters. You know, like Cindy said, you could have some years where actually you get accretion, and then the next year you get 3 big storms in a row and you've lost, you know, 2 meters of your coastline. So but how bad it gets is about how we as humans kind of live up to our Paris Agreement targets in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I suppose I'm going around in circles. It's very, very complicated. I think there's a lot that World Heritage can do because we have a convention that's very successful, that everyone's very attached to. There's a lot of sustainable development that can go around heritage sites, and there's a lot of goodwill. But I suppose partly it comes down to money and to people actually, you know, sharing the responsibility. And I think that is a risk for the World Heritage Convention, is if we start seeing sites being taken off the list in small island developing nation states because of problems which originated from the developed world, then that's going to seem grossly unfair. And I think that's a problem. So and that is one of the issues in the policy discussion, was this idea of common but differentiated responsibility, which is all about that. It's about the fact that we all have a common responsibility, but it should be differentiated between those who've contributed most to the problem and those who haven't. So that is also in the policy. So that's another way that things can be managed.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Yeah, that was kind of the angle of my initial question about urgency, actually, to realize that we are behind, as Leanna said in many cases, it's time for action. We have a question in the question and answer, I guess, for Cindy from Francois, saying that obviously some parts of, if not the entire World Heritage Site, would disappear, and we'll only be able to discover them through documentation. Which recording or documentation approaches and techniques are you suggesting to record and document the site and the associated value, maybe as a measure to adapt or mitigate the loss?
For the most part, the key archaeological sites have already been documented. The initial research at the site lasted terrestrial archaeology for about 14 years. So other than 3 or 4 of these rendering oven sites that were intentionally left unexcavated, and an unknown number that are still underneath the community, the houses where people still live, we have recorded what we know to exist. The one example I gave on Saddle Island of an unexcavated site, I've been planning some ground penetrating radar to help us determine the extent of that site and you know, how large it is, what there might be there to protect. The others are less easy to document because, as I said, they're underneath people's houses or sheds and other buildings in the community. So in one sense, being underneath existing structures is probably helping protect what is there. And that's an unknown quantity. We haven't been able to determine the extent of the site in some places because of that.
Okay.
Could I jump in? Not for that site. I obviously don't know anything about it. But I just, when you were talking about researching and documentation, I found it really interesting actually on, again, the island of Öland that I was working on. One of the documentation sort of things that they did was talking to elders in the community about place names and where the original field structures were. And then they linked them up to field structures that are there today. And many of them were exactly the same in the same location. They had, you know, similar names to what they originally had a few hundred years ago. So that kind of documentation is not necessarily archaeological in nature, but I'd say that intangible documentation as well is so important, especially in sites where, like all of the sites in Connecting Practice, where there are still people who are, you know, actively working on the agricultural practices of the site and are living, and sort of that's their daily link to work. So I just wanted to highlight that for the sites that were in Connecting Practice.
Yeah, thanks. Any more comments? So I think we've reached the limit of 3:30. So yeah, so I'm just want to thank you again, you three, for your participation and for your presentation, and thank all the participants who have been there with us. I'd like just make a quick reminder that we, ICOMOS Canada, are a non-for-profit organization, and we are relying partly on membership to do our activities and just to exist. And so if you are interested in heritage and in Canada, please consider visiting our website and maybe becoming an ICOMOS member if you're not, or renewing at some point if you were at some point. Thank you very much again for your participation, and we'll go on with 3 other sessions tomorrow, so stay tuned to this event. Thanks, and see you soon.